The observation deck of the Galactic Council Station buzzed with the usual mix of alien species, each representing their respective worlds in the grand theater of interstellar politics. Ambassador Zektar of the Vorthani Empire adjusted his crystalline breathing apparatus as he gazed out at the swirling nebula beyond the reinforced viewport. His 6 eyes tracked the movement of cargo ships and diplomatic vessels, but his mind was elsewhere, focused on the newest addition to their council, humans. The word itself seemed almost laughable to most of the assembled delegates. These bipedal mammals from a backwater planet called Earth had somehow managed to develop faster-than-light travel and stumble into their galactic community just 50 years ago. What truly amused Zektar and his colleagues wasn't their late arrival to the cosmic stage, but rather their peculiar obsession with what they called legends and mythology. "Have you read their cultural files?" asked Silthara, a tall, graceful being from the ethereal collective. Her translucent skin shimmered with bioluminescent patterns that indicated amusement. They actually believe their ancestors fought creatures called dragons and monsters. Their literature is filled with tales of individuals performing impossible feats of strength and courage. Ambassador Krell, a heavily armored representative of the Titan Brotherhood, let out a sound that resembled grinding metal, which passed for laughter among his species. Primitive storytelling to cope with their weak physiology. "We've run the scans. Humans are among the most fragile species we've encountered. Their bone density is laughable, their muscle fibers are inefficient, and they require constant sustenance and rest." The conversation was interrupted by the soft hiss of the observation deck's entrance. A human figure stepped through, and the various alien delegates turned their attention to the newcomer. It was James Morrison, the newly appointed human cultural attaché. Unlike the other human diplomats they'd encountered, who wore formal suits and carried themselves with the nervous energy of those trying to prove their worth, Morrison moved with a different quality entirely. He was older, perhaps in his 50s by human standards, with graying hair cut short and lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into harsh light. His posture was straight but relaxed, and there was something in his gait that reminded the more perceptive aliens of predators they'd known on their home worlds. He wore simple civilian clothes, but they fit him in a way that suggested a lifetime of physical discipline. "Ah, Mr. Morrison," Zektar called out, his voice carrying the artificial friendliness that diplomats perfected across all species. "We were just discussing human culture. Your mythology, to be precise. Quite fascinating, really, how your species created such elaborate fantasies to explain the world around you." Morrison approached the group with measured steps, his expression neutral. "Which myths were you discussing, Ambassador?" Silthara's patterns shifted to what humans might recognize as condescending amusement. "Oh, all of them, really. Tales of humans fighting impossible odds, defeating creatures 10 times their size, performing feats that would be physically impossible given your species' limitations. Your Hercules, your Beowulf, your David and Goliath. Charming stories for children, certainly. The warrior cultures particularly interest us," Krell added, his mechanical voice buzzing with what might have been humor. "Vikings, Spartans, samurai. Your species seems to have convinced itself that individual humans could be formidable in combat. Yet your own history shows that you needed thousands of individuals working together just to hunt the large predators on your own planet." Morrison listened without interruption, his hands clasped behind his back as he looked out at the nebula. When the aliens finished their commentary, he turned back to face them. "You've done your homework on human physiology. Standard procedure for all new species," Zektar confirmed. "We must understand the capabilities and limitations of our new council members. No offense intended, of course, but humans rank quite low in most physical categories. Strength, speed, durability, sensory acuity. It's remarkable that you managed to develop spaceflight at all. What's your background, Mr. Morrison?" Silthara asked, her tone suggesting polite interest. "Most cultural attaches are academics or artists. You have a different quality about you." Morrison's expression didn't change, but There was something in his eyes that made several of the aliens unconsciously step back. 28 years, United States Army. Special Operations. Retired as a sergeant major. The aliens exchanged glances. They were familiar with human military ranks from their cultural briefings, but the significance was lost on them. To their understanding, human military forces were primarily logistical operations, moving supplies, and providing support for automated weapon systems. "How quaint," Zektar commented. "We understand that human military service is largely ceremonial these days, given your reliance on technology for actual combat. Tell me, did you ever encounter any of these legendary monsters during your service?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his gaze returning to the viewport. In the reflection on the reinforced glass, the aliens could see something shift in his expression. Monsters come in all shapes and sizes, Ambassador. Some walk on 2 legs, some on 4, some on none at all. Some are born that way, others are made. Surely you don't mean to suggest that your mythological creatures actually existed? Krell's voice carried metallic overtones of disbelief. "I'm saying that humans have always been good at creating monsters, and even better at fighting them." Morrison's voice remained level, almost conversational. "Sometimes the monsters are external threats. Sometimes they're internal. Sometimes they're the people who think strength can only be measured in muscle fiber density and bone thickness." The observation deck fell silent except for the ambient hum of the station systems. The aliens processed this response, unsure whether Morrison was being metaphorical or if he was actually suggesting some form of supernatural belief. Silthara's bioluminescent patterns shifted to indicate confusion. "Are you saying that you personally believe in these mythological beings? Dragons and demons and such?" Morrison turned to face her directly, and for the first time since entering the observation deck, he smiled. It wasn't a particularly pleasant expression. "I'm saying that humans have a saying, 'God created men, but Samuel Colt made them equal.' It means that physical limitations can be overcome through ingenuity, determination, and proper application of force." "But your own species' data contradicts this," Zektar protested. "Humans require tools and technology to overcome even basic environmental challenges. Remove your technology, and you're helpless against most predators. Is that what you think?" Morrison asked quietly. Before any of the aliens could respond, the station's emergency klaxons began blaring. Red light bathed the observation deck as the automated announcement system activated. "All personnel to emergency stations. Hull breach in Section 7. Hostile entities detected. Repeat, hostile entities detected in Section 7. The assembled diplomats looked around in confusion. The station was supposed to be impregnable, protected by energy shields and automated defense systems that could repel anything from pirates to small fleets. The idea of hostile entities actually boarding the station was nearly incomprehensible. Zektar activated his personal communicator with trembling digits. "Control, this is Ambassador Zektar. What is the nature of the hostile entities?" The response came through crackling with static and background noise that sounded like screaming. "Unknown species, Ambassador. They appear to be. They're tearing through our security forces. Physical combat. They don't seem to be using weapons, just claws and teeth. They're hunting the civilians." Morrison was already moving toward the exit before the communication ended. "Where's Section 7 from here?" 2 levels down, forward section, Silthara answered automatically, her patterns now cycling through colors that indicated fear and confusion. "But the security forces will handle it. We should evacuate to the secure areas." Morrison paused at the exit and looked back at the assembled aliens. "How many security forces does this station carry?" 50 automated units, plus 20 biological guards, Krell answered. "All heavily armed and armored. More than sufficient for any reasonable threat." "And how are they doing against these unknown entities?" The answer came through Zektar's still active communicator in the form of more screaming and what sounded like metal being torn apart. Morrison's expression remained calm, almost thoughtful. Gentlemen, ladies, I think you're about to see why humans tell stories about fighting monsters. Sometimes it's not about the size of your muscles or the thickness of your bones. Sometimes it's about what you're willing to do when the monsters come calling. With that, he disappeared through the exit, leaving the alien delegates staring after him in confusion and growing terror as the sounds of combat echoed through the station's corridors. The diplomatic protocols they'd spent centuries perfecting had no provisions for this situation. Their understanding of human capabilities, based on careful analysis and scientific measurement, suggested that Morrison was walking toward his death. A single individual, even a trained one, couldn't possibly make a difference against entities that were overwhelming their professional security forces. But as the sounds of battle grew closer, and as their carefully ordered world began to crumble around them, the aliens began to wonder if perhaps they had misunderstood something fundamental about the species they'd been so quick to dismiss. In the corridors below, something was hunting, and for the first time in 50 years of galactic diplomacy, the humans were no longer the ones being studied and cataloged. They were about to become the ones others would tell legends about. The station shuddered as something massive impacted the hull, and the lights flickered. In the distance, they could hear new sounds joining the chaos. Not screaming this time, but something else entirely. Something that sounded almost like a human war cry. Morrison had reached Section 7, and the real education was about to begin. The corridors of Section 7 were a nightmare made manifest. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red shadows, and the air reeked of ozone, burned metal, and something else that Morrison's experienced nose identified as alien blood. As he moved through the damaged sections of the station, his trained eyes cataloged the destruction with professional detachment. The automated security units lay scattered like broken toys, their advanced alloys twisted and torn as if they'd been made of paper. Scorch marks on the walls indicated that their energy weapons had been fired, but whatever they'd been shooting had gotten close enough to rip them apart with what appeared to be crude physical force. Morrison knelt beside one of the destroyed units and examined the damage. Deep gouges in the armor plating suggested claws, but the spacing and depth were unlike anything in any database he'd ever seen. These weren't random scratches from a panicked animal. The cuts were precise, surgical almost, designed to sever critical components and disable the machines as efficiently as possible. A sound echoed from deeper in the section. Not the mechanical whir of station systems or the hum of artificial gravity, but something organic. A wet, sliding noise accompanied by what might have been communication between multiple entities. Morrison's hand instinctively reached for where his sidearm would have been during his active duty days, but civilian attaches weren't permitted to carry weapons on diplomatic stations. He picked up a piece of twisted metal from one of the destroyed security units instead. It wasn't much, but it had a sharp edge and decent weight. In the hands of someone who understood leverage and anatomy, almost anything could be a weapon. The communication sounds grew closer, and Morrison pressed himself against the corridor wall, using the damaged lighting to mask his position. His breathing slowed automatically, falling into the rhythm he'd learned during countless patrols in hostile territory. The civilian clothes he wore didn't have the armor plating or technological enhancements that modern soldiers relied on, but they also didn't make noise when he moved. The first creature that rounded the corner was unlike anything in any xenological database. It stood roughly 7 feet tall on 4 legs that ended in what could only be described as talons. Its torso was humanoid, but elongated, covered in what appeared to be natural armor plating that had a wet, organic sheen. Its head was angular, almost insectoid, with multiple eyes that glowed with their own inner light. But what drew Morrison's attention wasn't its alien anatomy. It was the way it moved. The creature wasn't rampaging or acting on pure instinct. It was hunting, using tactical movement patterns that any special operations soldier would recognize. It checked corners, used available cover, and moved with the patient precision of a predator that knew its prey couldn't escape. Behind it came two more of the same species, maintaining formation and communicating through a series of clicking sounds that had the rhythm of military signals. Morrison waited until all three had passed his position before moving. His approach was silent, a skill learned during operations where the difference between stealth and discovery meant the difference between mission success and a body bag. The improvised weapon felt familiar in his hand despite its crude nature. The first creature never sensed his approach. Morrison's strike came from behind, and below, the sharpened metal finding the gap between armor plates at what appeared to be the creature's equivalent of a spine. The blow was precise, delivered with the full weight of his body and 28 years of combat experience. The creature dropped instantly, its nervous system severed. The other two spun toward Morrison with inhuman speed, their multiple eyes focusing on him with predatory intensity. Morrison was already moving. The second creature lunged at him, claws extended in what would have been a killing blow against any of the station's other inhabitants. But Morrison wasn't like the other inhabitants. As the creature committed to its attack, Morrison dropped low and to the side, letting its momentum carry it past him while he drove the improvised blade into its vulnerable side. The third creature learned from its companion's mistakes. Instead of charging, it circled Morrison, clicking rapidly in what was clearly communication with something else. Morrison realized with professional interest that these things were coordinating with a larger force. He also realized that his improvised weapon had broken off in the second creature's body. The surviving creature seemed to sense his disadvantage and moved in for what it clearly expected to be an easy kill. What it found instead was 28 years of training that had turned a human body into something far more dangerous than the sum of its physical limitations. Morrison caught the creature's leading claws with his bare hands, using its own momentum to redirect its attack while bringing his knee up into what his combat experience suggested was a vulnerable joint. The move worked. The creature's leg buckled, and Morrison used its momentary imbalance to pivot and drive his elbow into the cluster of eyes that seemed to be its primary sensory organs. The creature reeled back, ichor streaming from its damaged organs, but it wasn't finished. It lashed out with its remaining functional limbs, and Morrison felt claws rake across his ribs, tearing through his shirt and drawing blood from the flesh beneath. But pain was an old companion, and Morrison had learned long ago not to let it dictate his actions. As the creature prepared for another attack, Morrison noticed something that his training had taught him to look for in any combat situation: the environment. The corridor they were fighting in had been damaged by the initial breach. Exposed power cables hung from the ceiling, sparking intermittently with dangerous levels of electrical current. Morrison began moving toward them, drawing the creature along with careful positioning and apparent retreat. The creature, sensing victory, pressed its attack. Morrison continued to give ground until he was directly beneath the exposed cables. Then, as the creature lunged for what it thought would be a finishing blow, Morrison grabbed it by what passed for its throat and rolled backward, using its momentum to flip it over his head. The creature landed directly on the exposed power cables. The electrical discharge that followed was both immediate and catastrophic. The organic armor that had protected it from the security force's energy weapons conducted the electrical current throughout its body, killing it instantly. Morrison rolled away from the electrical discharge and came to his feet, breathing hard but still functional. 3 creatures down, but the clicking sounds he'd heard suggested there were more. Many more. As if summoned by his thoughts, the sounds of combat echoed from deeper in the section. Not the mechanical whine of energy weapons this time, but something else. Screaming. Human screaming. Morrison began running toward the sounds, his civilian shoes slipping on the debris-covered deck, plating, but his pace never faltering. The screaming was coming from what appeared to be a civilian shelter area, where non-military personnel would have gathered during the emergency. He rounded a corner and found a scene from a nightmare. A dozen of the creatures had cornered perhaps 30 civilians from various species in what had been designed as a secure area. The The shelter's defensive systems had been torn apart, and the creatures were methodically hunting the trapped beings like predators playing with their prey. Morrison could see Galactic Council personnel, traders, tourists, and other civilians pressed against the far wall in terror. Some were trying to use their personal communicators to call for help. Others were attempting to hide behind overturned furniture and debris. None of them had any experience with real violence, and it showed in their panicked, ineffective responses to the threat. The creatures were taking their time, clearly enjoying the hunt. They would dart forward to slash at a civilian, then retreat to watch the terror spread through the group before selecting their next target. It was psychological warfare combined with physical predation, designed to maximize fear before delivering death. Morrison assessed the situation with tactical precision. 12 creatures, good positions, excellent coordination. Multiple civilians at risk, no backup coming, no weapons available except what he could improvise from the environment. By any reasonable military analysis, the situation was hopeless. But Morrison had spent his career in situations that looked hopeless to reasonable military analysis. He noticed that the shelter area had been designed with multiple support pillars to handle the structural stress of the station's rotation. The pillars were made of reinforced composite materials, but the connections to the ceiling appeared to use standard bolts and joints that could be compromised with sufficient force applied at the right angle. Morrison also noticed that the creatures, for all their tactical sophistication, were focused entirely on their prey. They'd positioned themselves to prevent the civilians from escaping, but they hadn't considered the possibility of someone entering the combat zone from behind. Morrison moved into position beneath one of the support pillars and began applying pressure to a critical joint. The composite material was strong, but leverage and persistence could overcome almost any engineering. Years of physical training had given him the strength to apply the necessary force, and decades of experience had taught him exactly where to apply it. The joint began to give way, just as one of the creatures noticed his presence. The alien predator let out a sound that was part roar and part clicking communication, alerting its companions to the new threat. Morrison timed his next action perfectly. As the creatures began turning toward him, he delivered a final blow to the weakened support joint. The pillar buckled, and the section of ceiling it had been supporting came down in a cascade of debris and twisted metal. 3 of the creatures were crushed instantly. The others found themselves separated from each other by the fallen debris. Their carefully coordinated hunt turned into individual combat situations. Morrison was already moving toward the nearest isolated creature, using a piece of fallen debris as both shield and weapon. The alien tried to bring its claws to bear, but found itself fighting not just against a single opponent, but against someone who was using the environment itself as a weapon. Morrison drove the creature back into a tangle of fallen cables and twisted metal, then used his weight and leverage to pin it in place while he applied fatal pressure to what appeared to be its breathing apparatus. The creature thrashed and fought, its strength considerable, but strength without leverage was just wasted energy. As that creature went limp, Morrison heard the civilians beginning to fight back. Not with any particular skill or coordination, but with the desperate energy of beings who had suddenly realized that survival was possible. They began throwing debris at the remaining creatures, creating noise and distraction that disrupted the aliens' coordination. Morrison smiled grimly as he moved toward the next isolated creature. This was something else the galaxy's species didn't understand about humans. They weren't just tool users or technology dependent. They were adaptable, and they were at their most dangerous when they stopped following the rules that others expected them to obey. The remaining creatures were learning this lesson the hard way, one fatal encounter at a time. But even as Morrison continued his methodical elimination of the immediate threat, he knew this was just the beginning. The creatures hadn't come alone, and whatever had brought them to the station was still out there. The real test was yet to come. The shelter area fell silent except for the heavy breathing of terrified civilians and the ambient sounds of a damaged space station. Morrison stood among the bodies of the creatures, bloodied but still functional, while the rescued beings stared at him with expressions ranging from shock to something approaching reverence. A young ethereal, her bioluminescent patterns flickering with trauma-induced confusion, approached Morrison cautiously. "How did you do that?" The security reports said these creatures were unstoppable. "They destroyed our automated defenses, killed our guards." Morrison wiped alien ichor from his hand with a piece of torn fabric, his expression remaining calm despite the adrenaline still coursing through his system. They were good hunters, but they made the same mistake everyone else does. They assumed that physical superiority equals combat superiority. But the scans show that their strength is 3 times that of a baseline human, protested a Titan Brotherhood engineer, his mechanical voice stuttering with disbelief. Their armor plating should have been impervious to improvised weapons. Their coordination was perfect. "Strength doesn't mean much if you can't apply it effectively," Morrison replied, already moving toward the shelter's communication console. "Armor doesn't help if your opponent knows where the weak points are. And perfect coordination becomes a liability when your tactics assume your enemy won't change the rules." He activated the console and began cycling through the station's internal monitoring systems. Most of the cameras had been damaged or destroyed, but enough remained functional to give him a tactical overview of the situation. What he saw was both better and worse than he'd expected. The better news was that the creature's assault had been concentrated in specific areas of the station. They weren't randomly rampaging through every corridor and chamber. They were following a deliberate pattern, targeting specific facilities and personnel. The worst news was what that pattern revealed. "They're not just hunting," Morrison said, his voice carrying the flat tone he'd used when briefing superior officers on enemy capabilities. "This is a surgical strike. Look at the targets: communication center, power distribution, life support control, and the diplomatic quarters." The assembled civilians crowded around the console, trying to understand what Morrison was showing them. On the screen, they could see the creatures moving through the station with purposeful coordination, not like animals driven by bloodlust, but like soldiers executing a carefully planned mission. "You're saying this is military action?" asked Ambassador Zektar Zaid, a nervous Vorthani who had been visiting the shelter when the attack began. "But we've received no warnings from any of our intelligence networks. These creatures aren't from any known species." Morrison's expression grew grimmer as he continued studying the tactical display. Maybe they weren't known until now. Or maybe someone has been very careful about keeping them hidden. He pulled up the station's external sensors and felt his blood run cold. 3 massive ships hung in the space around the diplomatic station, their hulls unlike anything in any galactic database. The designs were organic, almost grown rather than built, with surfaces that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. They were beautiful in the way that some predators were beautiful, sleek, and deadly, and perfectly adapted for their purpose. How did they get past the station's defenses? Morrison asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The Titan engineer activated his own interface, his mechanical appendages moving with nervous precision as he accessed the station's defensive logs. The perimeter sensors never detected them. No energy signatures, no gravitational displacement, no hyperspace disturbance. It's as if they simply appeared. Morrison studied the organic ships more carefully, his military experience cataloging details that might prove useful later. The vessels showed no obvious weapon ports or engine systems, but that didn't mean they were unarmed. Sometimes the most dangerous weapons were the ones you couldn't see until they were being used against you. A new sound echoed through the damaged station, a low, thrumming vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The remaining lights flickered, and several of the civilians cried out in alarm as the deck plating beneath their feet began to resonate in harmony with the unknown frequency. Morrison recognized the sound from his years of military service. It was the acoustic signature of a large force preparing for coordinated movement. Whatever was commanding these creatures was about to escalate the situation. "We need to move," he said, his voice cutting through the growing panic. "This shelter is compromised, and sitting here waiting for rescue isn't an option." "Where can we go?" asked the young ethereal, her patterns now cycling through colors that Morrison's cultural briefings had taught him indicated despair. "The security forces are destroyed, the automated defenses are offline, and our ships are too far away to provide assistance." Morrison was already gathering supplies from the shelter's emergency stores. Medical kits, emergency rations, portable lights, and anything else that might prove useful in an extended survival situation. His movements were efficient and purposeful, guided by muscle memory developed through countless field exercises. "We're going to the one place on this station that these creatures haven't hit yet," he said, shouldering an emergency pack and checking its contents. The human diplomatic quarters. The civilians exchanged glances of confusion and growing hope. If the human quarters had somehow remained secure, perhaps there was safety there after all. Morrison saw their expressions and shook his head. "Not because it's safe, because that's where they're going next, and I want to be there waiting for them." The Vorthani aide's crystalline breathing apparatus clicked rapidly with distress. "You want to walk into a trap? That's not survival, that's suicide." "No," Morrison replied, his voice carrying the absolute certainty that came from decades of experience making life and death decisions. "That's how you win a war. You don't let the enemy dictate the terms of engagement. You take the initiative and force them to fight on your terms, in the place and manner of your choosing." He began moving toward the shelter's secondary exit, gesturing for the civilians to follow. "These creatures are good hunters and excellent tacticians, but they've made one critical mistake. They've assumed that humans are just another soft target to be eliminated according to their standard protocols." As the group began moving through the damaged corridors, Morrison continued his impromptu lecture in tactics. "The problem with having superior physical capabilities is that you start to rely on them. You develop strategies and approaches based on the assumption that you can overpower any opposition through direct confrontation." They passed more evidence of the creature's systematic assault on the station. Destroyed security posts, damaged life support systems, and the bodies of those who had been caught in the initial wave of the attack. But Morrison noted something else as well. The creatures had been moving fast, prioritizing speed over thoroughness. They'd accomplished their immediate objectives, but hadn't taken the time to completely secure the areas they'd overrun. "That's going to be their downfall," Morrison continued, leading the group through a maintenance corridor that bypassed the main transit routes. "They've planned this operation based on eliminating resistance quickly and efficiently. But humans have a saying, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. They're about to learn what that means." The thrumming sound grew stronger as they approached the diplomatic quarters. Through the station's viewport, they could see that the organic ships had moved closer, their pulsing surfaces now casting an eerie glow over the station's hull. Morrison checked his improvised weapons and supplies one final time, then looked at the assembled civilians. They were terrified, confused, and completely out of their depth. In any conventional analysis, they were liabilities in a combat situation. But Morrison had learned something during his military career that the creatures hunting them apparently hadn't. Conventional analysis didn't account for the human capacity to exceed their limitations when the situation demanded it. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded soldiers in combat zones across 3 different planets. "What's about to happen isn't going to match anything in your diplomatic training or your cultural expectations. These creatures think they're hunting prey, but they're about to discover that humans have been both predator and prey for most of our evolutionary history." He pointed toward the human diplomatic quarters, where they could already see movement in the shadows. "Our species didn't climb to the top of our food chain by being the strongest or the fastest or the most heavily armored. We got there by being adaptable, persistent, and absolutely ruthless when our survival was on the line. The thrumming sound reached a crescendo, and the station shuddered as something massive impacted the hull. Through the viewports, they could see more of the creatures beginning to pour out of the organic ships, the numbers far greater than the initial assault force. Morrison smiled, and for the first time since the attack began, there was something genuinely predatory in his expression. Those legends your species find so amusing? The stories about humans fighting impossible odds and winning through sheer determination? You're about to see where those stories came from. The hunt was about to become very different from what the creatures expected. And James Morrison, retired Sergeant Major, was about to remind the galaxy why humans told stories about slaying monsters. The human diplomatic quarters had been designed to accommodate Earth's representatives with familiar comforts, standard gravity, atmospheric composition, and environmental controls that mimic terrestrial conditions. What the station's architects hadn't intended was to create the perfect battleground for a human fighting on home terms. Morrison led the group of civilians into Ambassador Chen's personal office, quickly assessing the tactical advantages the space offered. The furniture was human-sized and designed for human ergonomics, which meant it could serve as effective cover and concealment for someone who understood how to use it. The environmental controls included atmospheric processors that could be modified to create hostile conditions for non-terrestrial species. And, most importantly, the quarters included a small kitchen area with implements and materials that could be weaponized by someone with the proper knowledge. Stay low and stay quiet, Morrison instructed the civilians as he began rapidly modifying the room's layout. He overturned desks to create firing positions, rearranged furniture to channel movement through specific corridors, and began preparing improvised weapons from the kitchen supplies. The Vorthani aide watched in fascination and growing hope as Morrison worked. You're setting up some kind of defensive position? But there are dozens of those creatures, and more arriving every moment. Morrison paused in his preparations to look at the assembled aliens. Let me ask you something. In all your studies of human culture and mythology, did you ever wonder why so many of our legendary heroes were outnumbered? David facing Goliath, Leonidas at Thermopylae, Roland at Roncesvalles. The young ethereal's patterns shifted to indicate confusion. We assumed it was artistic exaggeration, humans creating stories to make their ancestors seem more impressive than they actually were. No, Morrison replied, returning to his work. Those stories exist because humans have always understood something that most species miss: the value of force multiplication through environmental control and tactical preparation. You don't need to be stronger than your enemy if you can make them fight where strength doesn't matter. He finished his preparations and moved to the quarters communication system, activating both the internal and external broadcasting arrays. When he spoke, his voice would carry throughout the station and to the organic ships hanging in space beyond. "Attention, hostile forces," Morrison said, his tone carrying the flat authority of a career military professional. "This is Sergeant Major James Morrison, United States Army, retired. You have assaulted a diplomatic station under the protection of the Galactic Council and have engaged in acts of war against multiple sovereign species." The thrumming sound from the alien vessels intensified, and they could hear movement in the corridors outside the human quarters. The creatures were responding to his broadcast, converging on their position exactly as Morrison had intended. "You have made several tactical errors in your assessment of this situation," Morrison continued, his voice steady despite the approaching threat. "First, you assumed that technological superiority equals combat effectiveness. Second, you assumed that numerical advantage guarantees victory. Third, and most critically, you assumed that humans are prey." A sound unlike anything they'd heard before echoed from the speakers. Alien communication that was clearly not the clicking of the creatures they'd encountered. This was something else, something larger and more intelligent, speaking in harmonics that made the station's superstructure resonate. Morrison smiled as he heard it. "Thank you for responding. Now let me explain why you've made a mistake." He activated the environmental controls, beginning to flood the human quarters with a specific atmospheric mixture that was harmless to human physiology, but would be disorienting to most other species. The temperature began to drop, and the humidity levels shifted to create conditions that would interfere with the creature's sensory organs. Humans evolved as persistence hunters. Morrison continued his broadcast while making final preparations. We didn't chase down prey by being faster or stronger. We chased them down by being more persistent, more adaptable, and more willing to change tactics when the situation demanded it. The first creatures appeared in the corridor outside the human quarters, their movements already showing the effects of the environmental modifications. They were still dangerous, still coordinated, but they were operating outside their optimal parameters. Morrison gestured for the civilians to take cover behind the defensive positions he'd prepared, then picked up his primary improvised weapon, a modified cutting tool from the kitchen that had been weighted and sharpened to serve as both blade and club. We also evolved as tool users. He continued, speaking to the alien intelligence commanding the assault. Not just using tools, but making them, modifying them, turning anything and everything in our environment into weapons when necessary. The creatures began their assault on the human quarters, but they found themselves funneled into narrow approaches where their numbers meant nothing, and their superior individual capabilities were negated by the tactical environment Morrison had created. He met the first creature at a choke point between two overturned desks, using the confined space to prevent it from bringing its claws effectively to bear while allowing him to strike with maximum leverage and precision. The improvised weapon found weak points in the creature's armor that his combat experience had taught him to look for. Behind the defensive line, the civilians watched in amazement as Morrison systematically dismantled the assault. Each creature that entered the engagement area found itself fighting not just against a human opponent, but against an environment that had been carefully engineered to neutralize their advantages. But, most importantly, Morrison continued his running commentary while dispatching his fourth attacker. Humans are the galaxy's preeminent experts at asymmetric warfare. We spent our entire evolutionary history figuring out how to kill things that were bigger, stronger, faster, and more dangerous than we were. The alien intelligence responded with another harmonic communication, this time carrying undertones of what might have been frustration or anger. The assault intensified, with more creatures pouring into the human quarters. Morrison adapted his tactics accordingly. As the number of attackers increased, he began using the environmental modifications more aggressively, creating atmospheric conditions that would severely impair the creature's coordination while having minimal effect on human combat effectiveness. The Titan engineer, inspired by Morrison's example, began using his mechanical appendages to operate the room's defensive systems, creating barriers and obstacles that further disrupted the creature's assault patterns. You want to know the real difference between humans and most other species? Morrison asked, his breathing still controlled despite the intensity of combat. Most species develop their combat capabilities around their natural physical advantages. Humans developed our combat capabilities around the assumption that our enemies would always be physically superior. He demonstrated this principle by using one creature's own momentum against it, redirecting its attack into another creature, and creating an opportunity to eliminate both with a single precisely placed strike. The young Ethereal, watching from behind cover, found herself beginning to understand something that her species' careful analysis had missed. "It's not about individual strength," she whispered. "It's about systematic adaptation to hostile environments." Morrison heard her and nodded approvingly while parrying another creature's attack. Exactly. Every human culture developed the same basic understanding. The universe is trying to kill you, and survival requires constantly finding new ways to kill it back. The assault was beginning to falter. The creatures, for all their individual capabilities, had been trained for rapid strikes against soft targets. They hadn't been prepared for extended combat against an opponent who treated their presence not as an overwhelming threat, but as a tactical problem to be solved through methodical application of force. Morrison activated the final phase of his defense, a chemical mixture he'd created from cleaning supplies and medical materials that would create a toxic atmosphere for most carbon-based life forms while remaining harmless to humans. The creatures began retreating, their assault broken against defenses they hadn't anticipated. This is why humans tell stories about fighting monsters, Morrison said into the comm system as the immediate threat receded. Not because we're naturally brave or unusually strong, because we're the species that learned how to turn environmental disadvantages into tactical advantages. The alien intelligence's response came not as communication this time, but as action. The organic ships began moving away from the station, their pulsing surfaces dimming as they prepared to leave. Morrison watched their retreat through the viewport, his expression thoughtful. They're learning. That's good. It means they're intelligent enough to recognize when they've encountered something unexpected. The Vorthani aide emerged from cover, his breathing apparatus clicking with what Morrison recognized as amazement. You drove them off, an entire invasion force, and you drove them off with kitchen implements and furniture. I had help, Morrison replied, gesturing toward the civilians who had assisted in the defense. And I had the advantage of fighting on familiar ground with familiar tools. Ambassador Zektar's voice crackled through the station's communication system. Mr. Morrison, this is the observation deck. We monitored your engagement. How is this possible? Our analysis indicated that humans were physically inferior to most galactic species. Morrison began the process of restoring the human quarters to normal environmental conditions while responding. Your analysis was correct, Ambassador. Humans are physically inferior to most galactic species. But you made the same mistake our enemies just made. You assumed that physical capability equals combat effectiveness. He gestured around the modified quarters, where the evidence of his tactical preparations was still visible. Humans didn't become the dominant species on our planet by being the strongest or fastest predator. We became dominant by being the most adaptable, the most persistent, and the most willing to use every available resource to overcome our limitations. The young ethereal approached Morrison cautiously, her patterns now showing something that might have been reverence. The legends we discussed earlier. Hercules, Beowulf, David, and Goliath. They weren't fantasies, were they? Morrison considered the question while cleaning Icor from his improvised weapons. They were human truths translated into mythological language. Every culture in our history developed stories about individuals overcoming impossible odds because that's what humans do. We face things that should kill us, and we find ways to survive anyway. He looked out at the retreating alien vessels, now barely visible against the stellar background. Those creatures out there learned something today that every species in the galaxy should understand. Humans don't have superior physical capabilities, superior technology, or superior numbers. What we have is superior adaptability. The station's emergency systems began coming back online as the surviving security forces worked to restore damaged systems. The immediate crisis was over, but Morrison knew that the implications of what had happened would resonate throughout the galactic community. The stories your species finds so amusing about human legends? Morrison said to the assembled aliens, "You're living in one right now. In 50 years, when your children ask you about the day mysterious aliens attacked a diplomatic station and were driven off by a single human armed with kitchen implements, what are you going to tell them?" The ethereal's patterns shifted to colors Morrison's cultural training had taught him indicated deep thought and newfound understanding. I think I'm going to tell them the truth. That we learned why humans tell stories about fighting monsters. Morrison nodded, then activated the station's external communication array one final time. His message wasn't directed at the retreating ships, but at the galaxy beyond. This is James Morrison aboard Galactic Council Station Harmony. Be advised that hostile forces of unknown origin have been repelled through application of standard human defensive protocols. Any species considering similar actions should be aware that human legends exist for a reason. He paused, then added with a slight smile, "Earth sends its regards." The message would reach every corner of the galaxy within days. carrying with it a new understanding of what those seemingly fragile beings from the small blue planet were actually capable of when their survival was threatened. The age of underestimating humanity was over. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, the retreating aliens were learning to tell legends of their own.